Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what is happening and how are you doing? How is your podcast coming along? Hopefully you have a podcast, but if you do not have a podcast, don't you worry. I'll get you all figured out, get you set up. And trust me, it's not as hard as everybody apparently makes it seem to be, as if they're the only ones that could do this. Don't you worry, you can do it too. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on a little master website, which I built all by myself. Yeah, I'm not really tech savvy, but I figured it out at chrisandchristineshow.com, and there's a link to it in the show notes of this episode. You just scroll on down and there you go. And on that website, we have information about our podcast, of course, information about us, and links to Podtastic Audio, links to Christine Smith Designs, which is an actual real company that Christine owns about doing wedding planning and wedding preparation for weddings and things like that. And of course, a link to Podtastic Audio, and of course, our radio station, which is K2 Radio. That thing is playing live, 365, as it were, 24/7, with music and some podcasting stuff I sprinkled in there too. But mostly, it's just music. But here, we are on Podtastic Audio, where I'm going to tell you how to make an amazing podcast without having to spend amazing amounts of cash to get the job done. Now, listen, you can podcast with whatever gear you have, but I would recommend having something decent, something a little better than your phone set on speaker mode, sitting in the middle of a table where 5 of your friends get up there and decide to talk over each other about a podcast or talk about your favorite movie or whatever it is you want to talk about. Hey, listen, your show is your show. Do it however you want to do it. Don't let me or anybody else tell you exactly how to do your own show. If the goal is to have fun and you are having fun doing your podcast, then congratulations. You are a successful show. And that's just the thing. There are a lot of shows out there that sound like, well, how do I put this nicely? They sound like crap. Yeah, they sound really, really bad. It's because a lot of people, when they do a podcast, they don't think about the audio. The only thing they think of when they think of audio, they think, okay, the thing is recording. I see the thing blinking, or I see the little lines moving, or however they do it. They see it moving, and they know the audio is physically being captured, but perhaps they're doing this video show, whether it's a Zoom show, StreamYard, whatever platform they use. So they're really focused on the camera and what the camera is looking at and the background and the lighting and all that great stuff, which is fine, by the way. But because of that, the audio does suffer, and people do lack the audio know-how on how to create good and decent audio for their podcast. Now, one would say one of the reasons is because we live in a world today where every single person has a mobile studio right in their pocket. I'm talking about their smartphone. You take your smartphone out, it's got a decent camera. Most of them all do, even the new ones. I got an older iPhone, but still has a pretty decent camera. I can shoot 4K and all that great stuff, although I never really do because it eats up a lot of memory. But that's beside the point. But you can take really good video, and it shoots decent audio, or records decent audio, I should say, with the video when you do just a video thing with your phone directly. Now, people do that. They use their iPhones to record, YouTube videos, and they record short videos, and like kids like playing with their videos. And of course, right on the phone itself, there's the iMovie program, which you can use that to enhance your video and splice things together and really edit your videos, make it sound amazing. So I think in a world we live in today where it's so easy to pull our phone out and start recording anywhere, anytime, with no extra gear to bring along, no extra microphones or extra lighting rigs or any of that stuff. Just a phone. That's all you need. And it's already in your pocket. You're probably listening to it right now. So why would you have to go through all the trouble of figuring out all the extra steps to enhance the audio? when you strip away the video and all you have is audio and audio only, like this podcast you're listening to, you really start to hone in on the sounds of the audio more than you would if you're watching the video with the audio. I kind of figured that out a while back. I said, I'm watching this thing, but when I do listen to the audio version of the same thing, I really start to hear the differences in the sound. Probably because it's like, people say, you'll listen to this thing, but make sure you close your eyes while you're listening to it. You kind of strip away all the other visual noise, I should say, when you're really trying to listen to something. But I'm not here to bash video podcasting or podcasts that use video as their podcast source. That's fine and all. I love that stuff too. I just can't physically sit and watch two talking heads or two people talking for the entirety of an entire podcast episode. If it's say like an hour in length, I don't think I can sit and watch them talk the entire time. That's why I prefer the audio version. Now, people who listen to audio podcasts, I would have to assume that they're very busy people. Like they're always on the go. They are busy professionals. They've got things they're doing. They've got to be here. They got to be there. So if they're going to consume the content, your podcast, they're not going to sit and watch it on their phone for an hour and waste that hour sitting there doing nothing but just watching you. They'd rather be physically doing something else. Maybe doing the dishes, maybe working on a project. Who knows? Anything, walking, jogging at the gym, doing the workout. There's a million different things you can be doing while you're consuming an audio podcast. That is why I love the audio podcast format, because I physically can be driving and listening to many different podcasts. You can't do that while you're watching a YouTube video. Now, YouTube's great. I watch a lot of YouTube. I love YouTube for physically watching stuff. But if you're relying on using YouTube as a dedicated podcast platform, say you make your show and you just dump the entire thing onto YouTube and you call it a day. Oh, it's a YouTube thing. Yeah, it's great. It's your YouTube channel. That's great. YouTube has a different audience than, say, an audio podcast would, which brings me to my 3 core pillars for every podcaster out there. Every podcaster, including you and myself, really should focus on these 3 pillars when designing a podcast and creating a podcast. Pillar number 1, I would say, is why are you podcasting? Why are you physically doing it? Everybody has a different why, but you really have to think about this. Really, why am I creating a podcast? Why am I even doing this? I mean, it could be as simple as, me and my buddies want to hang out and talk about the latest whatever movie, and do the Zoom show and do that. Maybe it's because you're a big shot smarty pants and you want to share your knowledge out to the world. Maybe you want to create a podcast because you want to use the podcast as a vehicle to drive business to your real business, which could be fill in the blank, whatever it is. That's your why for podcasting. Or it could be just the fact that you want to prove to everybody that you physically can do something better than being the local, bagger at the grocery store or whatever low-paying job you might have. You podcast because you can do things that you normally would never do. You get to talk to people that you never would normally do in your day-to-day job. In your real job, you're just a lonely, whatever job you might have. But when you podcast, you're something special. You're bigger than life itself. You're bigger than your normal day-to-day job. That is some reasons, why people podcast. Now, pillar number 2 is equally important. All these pillars, I would say, are equally important. But pillar number 2 really is this. It's who is this for? No, not everybody, not for general people. Who specifically is your podcast for? Is it for mothers that are pregnant? Is it for adults that are transitioning into retirement? Is it for kids, entering, sports, or is it for coaches? Is it for clients that possibly want to be coaches? Is it for, who knows? Is it for drivers that want to learn how to drive better? Is it for cooks that want to learn to cook better? You got to be really, really specific, not even just like the general idea of who it's for. I mean, get really focused into like, my podcast is for Jill, and Jill wants to be a cook, and she's going to cooking school right now at night, but she's got 2 kids, and she's going through a divorce, and she drives a minivan that her husband left in the divorce, but he got the house, and she lives in an apartment. Like, you can get really specific if you really want to. If you do, it does help you craft a better show because you're talking directly to that one person. So you really want to know, who is your podcast for? Create the show for them. And eventually, your audience will come to you. But do not say, I'm making a podcast for everybody. I am going to be like the nightly news, or I'm going to be like the nightly talk show where it's for everybody. But even those shows or those news stations, well, let's take CNN and Fox News, for example. Yeah, they both say the news differently, and they both have 2 different audiences. One is designed for one type of audience, let's say the left, and one is designed for another audience, let's say the right. They're not the same, but people do listen or watch both. Yes, that does happen. But as you can tell, they really hone in on a particular person. So once you kind of figure out exactly who this podcast is for, that brings us to pillar number 3, which is, what kind of value does your podcast bring to the audience? Let's connect the dots here. So you have a show, it's for this type of person, and this type of person will listen to your show. But at the end of that, let's call it like a business transaction here. At the end of the transaction, the listener should have some kind of value that they took away from listening to your show. Now, it can be many different things depending on your show and your type of show. But at the end of the episode, the listener should say, that was a good show. I really learned something, or that show is very entertaining. I enjoyed it thoroughly because it made me not think about the crappy life that I'm living right now. It was an escape, just like movies and television is an escape from reality. That's probably why people that are very depressed really do enjoy going to the movies more often than not. Your podcast can be an escape for those people. They may be going through some very hard times, whatever possibly can be. I mean, it's their lives, but you listening to your podcast might actually bring them joy, might make them happy. It's an escape from the reality they're living with every day. And that could be a reason why to podcast. That could be a reason why they listen to your podcast. Not every podcast out there has to be strictly facts and data. Who wants to read a spreadsheet on the microphone? That doesn't sound very entertaining to me. I would suggest that maybe perhaps try to sprinkle in a little humor, a little bit of banter, a little bit of personality on the microphone. I know I make it look easy. It's not that easy for some people. I get that. So I know that a lot of people will just script out their podcast and just read all the facts, and maybe they'll insert some humor, in the script or whatever, however you do it. Listen, you do your show however you want to do your show. And that's the basic 3 pillars. It's, why are you doing the podcast? Who is the podcast for? And what kind of value does the listener get when it's all said and done? When they've actually finished your podcast episode, what kind of feeling do they get? That kind of reminds me of something. I should add maybe a 4th pillar. Here's a surprise. Here's like a bonus pillar to this whole thing I just come up with right now. The bonus pillar is this. What kind of feelings do you get as a podcaster after or during your entire podcast process? Does it make you happy to create a podcast episode? Do you see it as actual physical work and you're like, dreading a podcast episode? Is it becoming like a job where you have to like maybe book new guests and you have got to do the whole song and dance of one day you available and go back and forth and physically record the episode and got a schedule lined out and a whole spreadsheet thing and all that stuff. And it's like another job. And if it's like another job, maybe it's not very enjoyable because it becomes a job that you're working at very hard. and you're dedicating a lot of time to do it, and you're not making any money doing it. Or maybe you're making a little bit of money doing it, but it's definitely not enough to quit your real job over. So if you can podcast for a few years without ever making a single penny podcasting, you can do it with a smile every time you do it, then you're on the right track. But if you've been podcasting for, say, 1 year and you're wondering, where's the cash? How come I'm not making any money? I got to start making money with this thing. That's on you. You can go ahead and do that. But I do realize that the more fun you're having, the more enjoyment you're having doing something for free, then eventually things will turn around. Podcasting is a long game. It doesn't happen overnight. You're not instantly going to start a podcast and within like 10 episodes, all of a sudden, have money rain from heaven and you're rich and quitting your day job. I know there's YouTubers out there that make it look like they've been YouTubing yesterday and they've got, Lamborghinis and Ferraris that just bought just now. Check that out. I've been YouTubing for like a day and I'm a millionaire. Yeah, okay. That never happens. It rarely happens. I know some people have some success and, podcasting, like us indie podcasters here, most of us, if not all of us, do this because we love doing it. Not because we want to get paid doing it. It's because we love doing it. And I love podcasting. I love talking into the microphone. I love doing this stuff. That's why I've created the show in the first place, was to help you make a better show for your podcast. Listen, if I didn't care, or if I was thinking very selfishly like I was only thinking about myself, then I wouldn't be here doing this podcast for you. There's lots of ways to podcast, like I've said before, and there's lots of ways to get decent audio for your podcast. And I'm not even talking like spectacular, like studio quality audio. In fact, the room that I'm recording in right now is like one of the worst rooms to record audio in. Tile floors, solid, wooden desk with lots of shapes and corners. It's Echo City for the most part in here. And I know there's probably lots of different plugins you can get. You can go down the plugin rabbit hole and look at all kinds of ways to enhance your audio after the fact, after you recorded it. But it's always better to record decent sounding audio from the start. Now, one simple little trick to do that is whichever microphone you're using, talking to the right end of it. Yeah, I know it sounds like a no-brainer, right? But you would be surprised with those Blue Yetis out there. People are using those things incorrectly, set on the wrong setting, facing the wrong way, talking on the wrong end, from far away, picking all the room reverb up. To eliminate some of the room reverb, here's a simple little trick. Get really close to your microphone, not like eating the microphone, but fairly close to it. That way it kind of captures more of you and less of the room around you, and less work you have to figure out how to fix it in post-production. And after listening to a lot of bad podcasts that are out there today, it got me thinking that, gosh, maybe I'm working too hard on creating decent sounding audio for my audio podcasts, like this one and the Chris and Christine show. And there's times where I did some basic editing and some basic sound stuff on it and sent it out as is. And it was great. It sounded great and it was fine. The thing is that as long as it sounds better than a lot of the crappy other podcasts out there, then you're golden. People will gravitate towards a better sounding podcast than some hot garbage podcast that sounded like it was recorded in the bathroom on a Blue Yeti. I don't care what the content is. I mean, sometimes people will, say, oh, I'll forgive the bad audio if the content is really, really good. But you can never catch up to a slow start, meaning that if your podcast comes out with garbage audio and just garbage, and by the time you actually get to the real good content, it's already too late. People have tuned out. That's why I can't stand when people dump a ton of ads onto their podcast episodes. And I get it because they pay. Some pay a lot and some pay not so much, but there is a actual, dollar figure associated with an ad, and I get why people do it. Yeah, I get it. But, I can very easily skip on my podcast player with my phone or whatever device I'm using, skip it, skip, and I'm on to the content. In fact, every single podcast that I listen to that has ads in their podcast, I never listen to them anymore. I just skip them and get to the content. And that's how I do my listening for my podcast. And I'm sure that if you're putting a lot of ads in your podcast, there's a good chance that's also happening to you in your show. So just keep that in mind, that just because you put an ad out there in your podcast episode does not guarantee that the listener actually listened to it. This is not live television. This is not live radio where we have no choice but to sit here and listen to it. With radio, I guess you can turn the volume down and kind of wait till the music comes back or whatever. But here in podcasting land, we could just hit skip, and we're on to the content. Oh, and I almost forgot. Now we're speaking about pillars for your podcast. One more thing. Let's call this an extra bonus tip of the day, really, is that you should probably listen to your own podcast. What? Did I just blow your mind right there? What do you mean you don't? Oh, I edit the podcast. I do all the editing, so I listen to it then. No, I mean physically, like put it in your podcast player app, like play it and listen back to it and try to imagine what it's like for someone else to be sitting there listening to it and enjoy it. Now, it might help if it was an episode that was, say, a month or so ago, because it wasn't quite so fresh in your mind when you produced it. So go back to maybe an episode a couple months ago and press play and just see what it sounds like, what you sound like, what your content sounds like. See if you understand what it is you're talking about. How does it sound overall? Does it sound enjoyable? Do you press play on your very own podcast and sit back and say, who put all these stupid ads here? Why am I listening to this garbage? Or you're like, where is the content? Or where is the show? And why is there like some music? It sounds like it was recorded on a phone from a speaker at a concert. What is this garbage I'm listening to? Or wait, hello? Why do I have to crank the phone up like full blast to hear me talking? And then when my guest comes on, I got to like turn myself way down because they're much louder and it's off. Really do like, I guess you do an audit of your own podcast. See what it sounds like. See if it resonates with you. Because at the end of the day, really create a show that you would really want to listen to and really would want to enjoy. So as we move into August, it's early August as I record this episode. July flew right by, but for me, July was very, very busy. You see, I was traveling all around the world for the most part. I was in Hawaii, as you might remember from the last episode. I flew back here to San Diego, and then I was only here for like a few days, and then I flew into New York City on the East Coast, and I was there for like about a week or so. And then while I was there, I was a surprise VIP guest in person on a podcast, which is incredible to do. I actually had so much fun on the Basement Surge. I will put a link to the YouTube video in the show notes of this episode. And while I was there, I got to see and experience what it's like being at somebody else's podcast setup in the basement with all the camera rigs and the computer stuff and the Rodecaster and the different microphones, all that great stuff. It was amazing that we were very welcomed in the house and we had lunch, hung out for a little bit, but we were kind of busy on a tight time schedule. But while we were there, we recorded a podcast episode. It was fantastic. I really did enjoy doing it. So it's a different experience when you actually are being a podcast guest in person versus the whole StreamYard thing or perhaps maybe the Zoom thing. But I am back and I am back in business. Hey, thank you once again for listening. You know what? If you have any problems creating your podcast, maybe need some one-on-one help to figure out the problems maybe you're dealing with, you always email me at podtasticaudio@gmail.com and I will respond with my best answers to try to figure out the problems that you might be having with your show. And I'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you for listening.